different world. We've been talking about the U.S. quite a bit, but very few people are, maybe because Trump is so omnipresent right now, but very few people are asking the question, what is the grand strategy of China? And it feels to me like that's the next big question we need to ask ourselves. What is China's grand strategy?
Well, Matt, again, they've been relatively transparent on that. If you read past policy papers, they have an incredibly effective system where you have, the most productive features of some elements of capitalism alongside an enormous state role. And 100% you have what is a grand macro strategy of increasing China's footprint across every global supply chain and every liberal world order institution, such that, Chinese authority and position within them grows and grows to the point where effectively China comes to dominate more and more of them. So let me give you one statistic. In the year 2000, 6% of manufactured goods globally were made in China. 6. That's pre-WTO entry. The projection from the UN, and I no longer think we're on this path, but the projection pre-recent Trump orders was by 2030, China would make 45% of manufactured goods. Now, if you use my methodology of just keep projecting things forward, and it will tell you when something is not sustainable as a result, by 2040, where do you think we would be? 75? Possibly. By 2050, where are you? 80? 90? At what point does China make everything? Or almost everything? Now, is that sustainable? Clearly not from a national security perspective, because the large players like the US in particular will say, we can no longer make F-35s or aircraft carriers without inputs from China. What if we can't get them? Then we don't have any military power. If we don't have any military power, the key pillar underpinning the liberal world order is gone. Because while everyone likes the liberal world order, and countries in Europe, very much so, and not having a go, but very much Canada, presumed it was the attractiveness of the liberal world order that made it sustainable, rather than US military muscle behind it, saying to everyone like the Houthis, if you muck around with this, we'll blow you up. And notice as soon as the US stopped doing that, the people like the Houthis did appear and did start mucking around with the liberal world order and close down the Suez Canal, which is kind of important and doesn't get enough focus. People didn't realize that. So it was never sustainable because someone was at some point going to say this can't go any further. And then the problem is, to come back to your question about China, what do you do when you have a model which is based on growing exports faster than your economy when people won't absorb them?
That's China's issue at this moment, that they're so efficient at exporting that at some point there's no market to export to anymore, or it's saturated though.
Well,
So that's the
that would
biggest
happen.
issue.
That would happen if the US and Europe, as two large blocks, and Canada, for example, which is looped into this, because Canada currently doesn't have tariffs on China, mainly, one or two things, but mainly it doesn't. Very clearly, the US wants Canada to follow its lead, and Europe. All of them are resisting because they're so integrated with those supply chains, and they understand that once you burn that bridge, it doesn't come back, and you head for global bifurcation. And if you're free trading, freewheeling Europe and Canada, we want to be friends, and yeah, we have issues over here, but we still want to trade with you. You can't go down that bifurcation route. But then the US won't let you not go down that route. This is one of the big standoffs that really everything we're seeing is about in the US and Europe, and the US vis-a-vis Canada. I'm telling you, this is what it's actually about. If you look at it through a statecraft lens, and I stress that's my job, that's what I'm doing. I'm not making a forecast. I have to keep qualifying that, right? But if you look at that lens, that's what it's about. So that's not an issue for China today. Their grand strategy is to continue doing what they've been doing, and it's working very well. But they have to be prepared for the fact, because they do look forward, they can see these things, that within, X number of months or years, potentially the thing or the world around them changes. And then they have to start thinking, what do they do? And then they will be addressing new issues strategically. How do we cope with the fact that we're too efficient?
Which leads me to my next question. What will be China's response to essentially Trump's tariffs and perhaps even aggrandizing alliance. Let's say the United States convinces Canada to impose tariffs themselves on China, maybe Mexico too, maybe Europe, as you just said. China will respond sooner or later. They already have with their own tariffs on certain things, I believe. But ultimately, next 6 months to a year, let's just say, what can we expect from China as a response to U.S. measures that are making the news right now?
Well, again, I'm not going to forecast what they will do because that's not my job. My job is to look at the hypothetical range of scenarios of what they could do, looking at the world a certain way. And clearly, you have a spectrum from the very mild to the very extreme. I mean, this is logical. And at the very mild level, you just you offer complaints, or you try and persuade people to shift from one camp to the other by temporarily opening your market. For example, saying suddenly we want everything that Canada makes in this area, because they're currently tariffing some Canadian products, as you're aware. Suddenly those tariffs disappear and they place a bulk order. Great, free trade is back. You've won. Well, not really. You've been coaxed out of one camp temporarily into another in order to break that putative hypothetical alliance. That would be one end, which I can assure you many people will immediately fall for because they do every time China play that particular card. At the complete other extreme, of course, you have saber rattling. We've had a Chinese cruiser sail past Australia and New Zealand who are part of this discussion as well, whether they like it or not, in a similar position to Canada, except their distance from the US is further. What was that going around there for? Why did you have a cruiser and a destroyer and potentially a submarine underwater protecting them just off the coast of Sydney? Tourism? No, it's clearly an indicator of where things could go at the worst case, other extreme. And in the middle, somewhere between the two, you have China saying, well, suddenly there's a problem with the supply of this key component that you need. All your industry is still running on this widget or this piece of wire or this input, which we have. We make 80% of. You don't control the supply chain. And suddenly we're short. We can't send it to you. And your economy hits the buffers. So those are your range of outcomes. And then you get into game theory about, okay, what does each player do in that particular scenario? But it comes down to fairly simple options. At the end of the day, when you resolve it, which is you do something about it and you continue to move supply chain so that threat doesn't exist, which reorders the world, or you don't, and you go back to a scenario which is the status quo ante, which is effectively you just say we can't rock the boat, and so that current Chinese strategy is superior to the West's and wins. If you plot it all out in your head hypothetically. And again, I'm not saying what will happen. I want to keep repeating that because no one can tell you what will happen. But you need to have a consistent understanding of the game being played. And if that game doesn't change, these are the potential moves the pieces can make.